Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin wal aqibatu lil muttaqin ala umurid dunya wa din. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Fatihi lima ughliq wal khatimi lima sabaq nasiril haqqi bil haqq wal hadi ila siratikal mustaqim wa ala alihi haqqa qadrihi wa miqdarihi al-azim. Alhamdulillah, tonight we are so grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his blessings and his mercy that we are able to gather here tonight together to learn more about Islam and to learn more about one figure which we should um, we should know about his existence, Imam al-Ghazali, of which his existence need no new introduction because almost everyone who is a Muslim and also maybe some most of the Westerners also know about him. And we are honored tonight because our distinguished speaker, Professor Frank Griffel, is indeed an expert and also an authoritative figure in the history of Islamic philosophy. And his research into Islamic philosophy has been read by many and has been received well among academicians. And I believe that some of you even crossed to some of his books, such as al-Ghazali's philosophical theology, and also the formation of post-classical Islamic philosophy, which talk about philosophy after al-Ghazali. And tonight we are so honored because he will be delivering lecture on al-Ghazali's mysticism, of which he will be talking about the philosophical foundations of al-Ghazali's mysticism, of Imam al-Ghazali's mysticism. So tonight we will be giving him chances to deliver his lecture and also for you to interact with him after his lecture. You may ask him, you may discuss with him pertaining to the lectures, and you may also, well, we open for some criticisms. But if you wanted to criticize what he wrote, what he delivered during his lecture, please give it in a mannerful manner, and please do it with adab. All right. Without further ado, I would like to invite our distinguished speaker tonight, Professor Frank Griffel, to deliver his lecture. Prof, you are duly invited. Tafaddal ma'juran.
Shukran jazilan, ya Shaykh.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm very grateful to the Center of Advanced Irfan Studies in Malaysia to speak a little bit about my research. As Shaib has said, I'm a professor of Islamic Studies at Yale University in Connecticut in America currently, though I will actually be moving over the summer to another position at the University of Oxford. What I will talk about is indeed research that I've done for the book that came out already in 2009. Somebody might have seen this, Al-Ghazali's Philosophical Theology. This book has also been translated into Arabic, al-Ghazālī wa falsafatuhu al-Kalamiyya. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is important to understand about the foundations of al-Ghazali's mysticism. Now, I should also say that when you take a look at this book and you want to find insights about al-Ghazali's mysticism, there is actually not all too much there. The book deals mostly, first of all, with al-Ghazali's life very thoroughly, I hope, insofar as it goes to all the sources in al-Ghazali's life and establishes what really happened, given the fact that he himself also talks about his own life and gives, I think, sometimes ambiguous impressions. And then it goes into some of his philosophical works. So it deals a lot with tahafut al-falāsifa, and then books where he talks about the subject of cosmology, that is God's relationship to this world, in such works, for instance, as al-Maqsad al-Asna, Mishkat al-Anwar, Iljam al-Awam. Those are books that I actually look into. I write very little there about Sufism, but since then I've also done a lot of research about it, and just want to give you an idea in this case of what my impression is. Generally speaking, and maybe this is just a general introduction of what happened in the field of Ghazali studies in the West, that some of you might not be so intimately familiar with. But Ghazali has always played a very important role in any kind of Western study on Islam. Generally speaking, al-Ghazali was discovered around 1830. The first book that became available of his works is al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, which was edited in the 1830s, and from that moment on there was also a French translation and played a major role. And then one by one, more and more works actually became available. When we, for instance, look at major encyclopedias on Islam, for instance, there is the project of the Encyclopedia of Islam. By now we have 3 editions. The first edition, which came out at around 1900, second edition, which came out in the second half of the 19th century. And now we are actually working on a 3rd edition. So particularly when we look at the first edition, which actually was first came out after 1900, 1908 until 1930, lots of articles there. Whenever anybody wrote anything about Islam, be it, for instance, like prayer, salat, or fasting in Ramadan, or the principle of al-amal bil ma'ruf wa-nahy anil munkar, and all these things. When Western authors wrote about it, they, in the most cases, cite al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali was considered, the voice of orthodoxy of Islam. In particular, his Ihya Ulumuddin was seen as such. Then with regard to his life, there was a position, and that's very similar to, the majority Muslim view, that people actually read his Munqidh min al-ḍalāl very, very closely. And in this Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, of course, the major scene is where he talks about his tawbah, where he talks about his change in life. As you know, al-Ghazali, of course, grew up in Tus, was trained there in the Nishapur at the Niẓāmiyya by al-Juwayni, Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni, Imam al-Haramain, and then has a close relationship to the Seljuk Sultanate through the figure of the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, who actually sends him to sends him to Baghdad to teach at the Niẓāmiyya there. Al-Ghazali writes about all of this in his Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, in his autobiography, and then he says at one point in time, which is in the year 488 Hijriyan and 1095 Miladiyan, he actually has a crisis, and this crisis led him to leave the Niẓāmiyya in Baghdad, and then go to Damascus first, then to Jerusalem. Then there is an important event in Hebron, and then he goes on pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. He's not very clear about what really happened after he left Baghdad, and there were lots of rumors that he might also have gone to Egypt. But it's very clear. One can really reconstruct his whereabouts very clearly, and I've tried to do this partly because I worked a lot with sources that were written by his students, which were not used before, and partly also because I worked closely with a collection of letters that he actually wrote, and he wrote these letters in Persian, which also hadn't been used before in order to establish his live whereabouts. And what I also try to do in this book is that I look at his date of birth, and which is usually given as 1058 Miladiyan. And I think actually that's incorrect. I think when we look at his own, in his letters, actually he talks about his own age. And when we actually look at that, we find that he was born about 2 years earlier, which actually matches the fact that during his tawbah that he experiences in Baghdad in 1095 Miladian, he's actually 40 years of age, which is, of course, the age, as you know, that Muhammad received the first revelation. It's also the age, for instance, that al-Ash'ari converted from Mu'tazilism to his own theological school. So these are quite coherent views. Now, when we look at al-Ghazali's life, and we also take a look at the sources that we have from his students, and there's particular one student is important, who was Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi. This is not Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. This is somebody who lived 2 generations earlier, Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who came also from Al-Andalus, and who studied with al-Ghazali, and who wrote a lot in his own writings about his meetings with al-Ghazali, about his studies with al-Ghazali. And he actually tells us that, this crisis that al-Ghazali experienced in 1095, where in his Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, al-Ghazali says, this was something that came very suddenly through his exposure to Sufi literature. In his autobiography, he says, how he discovered the writings of major Sufi writers, and he read them, and these actually brought about the crisis that led him to leave the Niẓāmiyya madrasa and also change his life entirely. So Ibn al-Arabi, Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, also writes about that, and he gives us a different picture in the sense that, this is something that had a longer trajectory. It wasn't very sudden. Al-Ghazali started to read Sufi literature earlier. We also assume that even in his youth, he already had exposure to Sufism. There was actually a teacher in his in the circles in Tus, where he actually was exposed to Sufism. So that he was familiar with Sufism before, and that what really became a problem in Baghdad was his relationship to political power. And that is also reflected. So first of all, in this case, you might say, the sudden turn towards Sufism is probably not all too historical. What we mean by that is when one writes an autobiography, one tries, or very often, what happens very often, particularly if you do it in a literal sense, you want to produce a good piece of literature, you condense a longer development to something that happens very suddenly and happens very dramatically. And I and other readers think this is happening in al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, meaning there is a turn towards Sufism in al-Ghazali without doubt, but this is something that has a longer has a longer development, and it might not have been as dramatic as he actually writes about. And most importantly, the crisis that he experiences in Baghdad is more or less one where he realizes that he can't work together neither with the Seljuk Sultanate nor with the Abbasid Caliphate. Because for him, particularly the Seljuk Sultanate is corrupt. They are raising taxes that are unjust. They are torturing or they are mistreating the ordinary people. And of course, this is, of course, there is a Sufi background to this. Of course, there's Zuhud behind it, and there is also justice behind it. And then he, when he actually goes, first he goes to Damascus to study with another leading Sufi. Then he goes to Hebron, and at the grave of Abraham, he actually vows, he makes a very vocal vow. He promises never ever to work together with any political authority, neither as an advisor, nor in a munazara, nor in a teaching capacity. So that he would not teach at a Niẓāmiyya madrasa, because the Niẓāmiyya madrasas, of course, was a system that was state-sponsored by the Seljuk Sultanate. And there was a question whether, the endowments that were given to the Seljuk madrasa, for instance, in Baghdad or in Nishapur, were actually truly legal. Meaning in this case that this was land that was given to the school, which might have actually been appropriated illegally. Those questions became important for him, so he said, in this case, I'm never going to teach again at a Niẓāmiyya madrasa. Now, when he and he returns to Tus, he teaches at his own small madrasa, which he calls a Zawiyah, and the Khanqa, Sufi Khanqa. So he has these 2 small establishments in Tus himself. But then at a certain point in time in his life, and this is about 10 years after he vowed in Hebron, the political authorities force him again, or put a lot of pressure on him to return to teaching at the Niẓāmiyya madrasa in Nishapur. And that's actually when he writes his Munqidh min al-ḍalāl. So the Munqidh min al-ḍalāl is an explanation why he broke the vow. And apparently each reader, every reader of Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, so al-Ghazālī assumed, was familiar with the vow, because it was a very public thing and he wrote about it in his letters a lot. But the vow itself, interestingly, is not mentioned in al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl. So it's an important background that when one reads this book, should really keep in mind that he has this. Now, okay, so far about his turn towards Sufism, and what I want to do now in the second half of the half hour that I've been given is to illustrate a little bit the way our al-Ghazālī actually turned towards Sufism. Now, my book, the book Al-Ghazālī's Philosophical Theology, is a lot about Al-Ghazālī's relationship to Ibn Sīnā, which usually is seen as Al-Ghazālī responding and refuting Ibn Sīnā. Now, already when one reads al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, the autobiography, of course there is a chapter in there where he condemns falsafa. But there's also a chapter in there where he actually writes very appreciatively about falsafa, and says in this case, there are lots of things in falsafa that are helpful for a Muslim theologian to actually keep in mind and to learn from. And he gives the picture of, he says in this case, if one horse walks into the footsteps of another horse, there is nothing wrong about that. So basically saying in this case, if he, in his own thinking, follows in certain elements Ibn Sīnā, there's nothing wrong about that. And I think this is very important to realize that there is a lot in Al-Ghazālī where he actually, takes over teachings from Ibn Sīnā. He's very influenced by him, I think. And there is particularly the idea, or the whole subject of, we call it psychology. Now, with psychology, we don't mean anything here that this psychology doesn't have anything to do with Sigmund Freud. This is Aristotelian psychology, meaning in this case, the teachings about the soul. And I want to read a passage from al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, where I think a very central passage where he admits that for a long time he was uncertain about the nature of the soul, what the human soul is, and then turns towards Ibn Sīnā's idea about the soul and the falāsifa's idea about the soul, which he doesn't write very open about. You will see when I read the passage. But the background is the following. Now, of course, for us, it's modern, we think about the soul very similar as, you might say, Ibn Sīnā almost, right? The soul is a substance that exists connected to the body, but not necessarily in the body or on the body. And some of us also might believe in this case, that soul is then able to survive after the death of the body. Now, these are all teachings that are also, which Ibn Sīnā subscribed to, but they are not very widespread at the days of al-Ghazālī. So, the Ash'arite and the Mu'tazilite teaching about the soul, basically the Kalam teaching, what Mutakallimun, what all of them were convinced in the days of al-Ghazālī, is that the soul is actually not a distinct substance from the body, but it is something that inheres in the body. So meaning in this case, my knowledge, for instance, is something that inheres in my heart. So is faith is something that inheres in the heart. And when the heart disappears, the assumption also in this case is that those things actually disappear. So there was a very different understanding of what the soul is, connected in this case with atomism of the body, and these atoms actually carry things that we would call today cognitions, for instance. Now, Al-Ghazālī grew up with this idea of the soul, but let me read the passage, and I first read the passage and then I read the English translation. I read the passage in Arabic. And then let me read the English translation. So this is in the chapter Sabab Nashr al-Ilm, and let me read. ثم إني لما وظبت على العزلة والخلوة قريبا من 10 سنين بان لي إثناء ذلك على ضرورتي من أسباب لا أحصيها، مرة بالذوق، ومرة بالعلم البرهاني، ومرة بالقبول الإيماني، أن الإنسان خلق من بدن وقلب، وأعني بالقلب حقيقة روحه التي هي محل معرفة الله دون اللحم والدم الذي يشارك فيه الميت والبهيمة. So that's the passage that in the Munqidh min al-ḍalāl. Now let me quickly read this in English. For nearly 10 years, I assiduously cultivated seclusion and solitude. During that time, several points became clear to me, of necessity, of reasons I cannot enumerate. At one time by fruitional experience, this is what the translator here translates, doubt, fruitional experience. At another time by knowledge based on apodictic proof, this is al-Burhani. And again by acceptance founded on faith, and that is imani. These points were that man is formed of a body and a heart. And by the heart, I mean the essence of man's spirit, which is the seat of the knowledge of God, not the flesh, which man has in common with corpse and with beast. So what he admits there in al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl is that he was for a long time in his life, as he writes there, for the 10 years of seclusion that actually began with his tawbah in Baghdad. And it was a seclusion where he was refraining from teaching at Niẓāmiyya madrasas. He was teaching still at small madrasas. During this time, he was pondering over what the soul actually is. And the words that he found there, that there is badan and that there is qalb. And with qalb, of course, he means, at the end of the day, he means what Ibn Sīnā would call the nafs, which is the seat of knowledge, and which is also then a substance by itself. When you continue reading the passage, you will see he's very clear that he subscribes basically to Ibn Sīnā's psychology at that point in time. So there is a movement away from, you might say, kalam teaching towards philosophical teachings. And these philosophical teachings are important insofar they actually contain also a particular concept of, you might say, Sufi knowledge. That's also what he talks about that in the next, in the continuation of this passage, where he actually says, well, of course, in the passage already, he says, there are, I hope I still get it. There are three sources of knowledge that made him certain in this case. One, he says, maratan bil dhawq, maratan bil ilm al-burhani, wa maratan bil qubul al-imani. So there is, of course, philosophical knowledge, ilm burhani, but there is also dhawq, which we might talk about what that actually is in the discussion. I think it's what we call a philosophical sense perception, so the perception of the inner senses, and I think it's very close to what in Arabic we would call tajriba. And then there's qubul imani, which might actually be seen in this case as things that are revealed through certain faculties of the soul. What I mean to say is, when we actually read Ibn Sīnā very closely, we find that he has a philosophical explanation of prophecy, meaning for the time we should translate it as a scientific explanation of prophecy. That's, of course, something we no longer adhere to in the 21st century. When you ask a scientist, can you explain Muhammad's prophecy? They will probably say, no, there's nothing in the sciences that can really explain, in this case, how he might have received revelation. Ibn Sīnā was of a different opinion. Ibn Sīnā says, prophets have a certain ability that we all have to a small degree, but that they actually have to a larger degree. And that is to connect with the celestial intellects. That means, in this case, the intellects that connect between God and the realm of the sublunar world, the realm of the earth. And these are intellects that exist in the heavens. These are, for instance, intellects that are connected with certain spheres in the heavens, the sphere, for instance, of Jupiter, the sphere of Mars, the sphere of Venus. All of them have intellects, and these intellects have a certain foreknowledge of events in the future. And al-Ghazali also writes about that. He says in this case, we all have a small part of this kind of knowledge, not to a degree like a prophet has, but we, for instance, when we have the experience of déjà vu, meaning in this case, you find yourself in a situation, you say, oh, I've been here before, I've seen this before, maybe in my dreams. Then al-Ghazali actually sees this as a sign that we do in our dreams really have a kind of foreknowledge of things in the future. We also see things, we get knowledge in our dreams from the celestial spheres. And he explains this with, we want to say, Aristotelian or Avicennian psychology, insofar as in our dreams, our senses, our outer senses are not used. Our soul can actually connect or can is aware of things that in waking life also happens, but are, too, you might say, insignificant for us really to realize it. In our dreams, we can really attend to that. And in our dreams, whatever we see in our dreams is something in this case that we conceive as knowledge. And this might be the qubul imani that he actually talks about in this in this quote. Whereas we have, normal people have this to a small degree, and the Prophet has it to a, you might say, maximum degree, particularly the Prophet Muhammad has it to a maximum degree. In between these two poles, you might say, us who have it to a very small degree and the Prophet Muhammad, there are people who have it to a larger degree, but we wouldn't call them prophets. And this is what Ibn Sīnā already talks about in his in one of his major works, al-Ishārāt, wa-l-tanbïhāt, and other works that he says in this case, there are people who are in between the prophets and the ordinary people, and these are the awliyāʼ. Now that's the word in this case that Ibn Sīnā does not use, but al-Ghazali does actually use. So what he does in al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, and also in several of his books in Ihya Ulumuddin, particularly the book number 22, it's 21 actually, and 22, Riyadat al-Nafs, where he talks about the superior insights that Sufi sheikhs have in comparison to other people. And for al-Ghazali, this is an important source, and this is where I end my short lecture here. This is an important source of knowledge that goes beyond rational knowledge. That's also something that is very clear in al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl, where he actually says, children grow up first with sensitive knowledge, with knowledge that we acquire through the senses, through repeated sense perception, which is experience, tajriba. And but sometimes our sense perception is wrong. And he gives examples, like, when, for instance, we look at the shadow and we don't realize that the shadow actually moves during the day. And then he says, well, but our intellect, our aql, corrects these sense perception. And he asked the question, well, similar to how intellect, aql, corrects sense perception, can there not be a higher source of knowledge than aql that corrects aql when aql is actually wrong? Now, this is, of course, a point that he makes against Ibn Sīnā. And he uses, and this is the interesting thing, that's the point that I end on. He kind of uses teachings that he has adapted from Ibn Sīnā, particularly Ibn Sīnā's psychology, his idea that humans do actually get direct knowledge from the celestial spheres and from their intellects. He uses this against Ibn Sīnā's point that all knowledge is something that should be able to be proven in arguments. It's not, sorry, this is not correct in this case. Al-Ghazali is also of the opinion that all knowledge is proven in argument. What he actually argues against in this case is that the sciences are developed by the great philosophers such as Aristotle or Plato. And he basically makes the point in this case that the sciences, knowledge, for instance, about the celestial souls, the celestial intellects, the movement of the spheres, all this is actually something that has been received by way of prophecy or by way of, you might say, inspiration. Ilham is the word here, that is given to the awliyāʼ. And that's where I stop after something like half an hour, and I'd be happy to have a discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Frank Griffel, for your enlightening lecture. So for everyone who attended today, the reason why we wanted to keep such a short lecture, because we want more of you to interact with our esteemed speaker today. Maybe you want to ask questions, maybe you have confusion, or maybe you have want something to discuss with Frank Griffel, and also maybe you want to criticize him for his idea and so on and so forth. So we open the chances for you all to interact with him. Please do interact with him. Silakan untuk berinteraksi dengan Frank Griffel. Di sini ada beberapa soalan. There is some question here. Professor Frank Griffel. Firstly, from Nuruddin. Prof, does the Sufi philosophical project emphasize aspects of epistemology and not ontology? Okay, that is the first question. I believe we may go with the first question first.
Yeah, so from al-Ghazali's point of view, I would actually say that, his understanding of Sufism is mostly, if not entirely, about epistemology. So the question really is, I think what pushes him towards Sufism is an argument that appears already in Tahafut al-Falāsifa. And that's an argument that he himself learned from other Muslim theologians, and interestingly enough from Ismaili theologians, from Shiite theologians, who in their response to philosophy actually made the following point. They said in this case, okay, so let's say, for instance, we talk about the knowledge that that astronomy has. Astronomy is, of course, one of the natural sciences. And in the astronomy of al-Ghazali's days, we're talking about, the Earth in the middle of a cosmos, around its spheres, and since the days of Ptolemy and other Greek sages, the mathematical computation of the position of the stars, or the planets, rather, the planets in the sky, has been practiced. You can actually predict where, Venus will be on a certain day, whether it will actually be, the morning star, or whether it will be the evening star. Those things can be more or less easily computed. Al-Ghazālī asked in this case, okay, so that's fine, but how did humanity as overall gain knowledge about this? And the argument that he became familiar with sounds like this, is, some celestial events are in fact so rare, and he talks about, that they only happen, once in 1,000 years. Now, if it happens once in 1,000 years in this case, then nobody can claim that that repeated sense perception led to an understanding of this event. Because repeated sense perception of an event that only happens once in 1,000 years in this case requires, many, many generations. And within even 3 millennia, you only have 3 times happening, 3 repeated issues. That doesn't give you really knowledge about something. So out of this argument, he actually says, okay, so you philosophers, you claim that you know this from observation, but I say you can't. Knowledge about the configuration of the heavens must be something that has a different source, and this different source can only be some kind of revelation, some kind of inspiration that God has given through the mediation of the celestial intellects to certain humans who are either prophets or awliyāʼ. So it's really epistemology that actually pushes him. Whereas in ontology, and the argument makes it clear, in ontology, he largely follows the views of the falāsifa, meaning in this case he accepts that there are these spheres in heaven. He also accepts, and this is an important point also about ontology and cosmology, that God doesn't give ideas directly into the minds of the humans, as earlier mutakallimun would have said, when with their idea in this case of the soul. They would say in this case God creates the knowledge that humans have directly as accidents in the heart of the human. He says no, it needs to be a process, and this process needs mediators, needs intermediaries, and these intermediaries are actually the celestial souls, and he also accepts that. It's a very good example to illustrate how al-Ghazali accepts a lot of things in Ibn Sina's ontology, and also some in his epistemology, but then adds his own element in his epistemology by basically saying awliyāʼ and prophets have superior insight to ordinary humans. Something, however, that generally speaking, Ibn Sina is not objecting to. Maybe the next question, Shoaib, will you choose the?
Yeah, I will be asked. There is another question. Actually, there are a lot of questions here in the chat section.
Okay.
Again, by Nuruddin. He asked, Prof, is it true that Ghazali's doubts were influenced by his struggle with Omar Khayyam? On the other hand, is it true that Khayyam's Rubaiyat was written to attack Ghazali's Sufism position?
Right. So historically, of course, there are lots of, you would say, unfounded information about the relationship from al-Ghazali to Omar al-Khayyam. They lived at the same time. Omar al-Khayyam was older, but there's only one text that talks about the relationship between the two. One, you would say, credible text. Later on, of course, you have a lot of, speculation about their relationship, but there's only one text, and that is Ibn Funduq al-Bayhaqi, and he talks about a meeting between Omar al-Khayyam and al-Ghazali in Nishapur, where the two of them actually discuss a philosophical question. Namely, whether a sphere can be divided. So that's a question of Aristotelian philosophy. It's an interesting question. It also comes up in Tahafut al-Falāsifa. And al-Bayhaqi, the author of this book, where this passage is actually, he is more on the side of al-Ghazali than Omar al-Khayyam. Al-Ghazali asked the question. Omar al-Khayyam, starts to give a very philosophical, long-winded answer. He starts, in this case, with the basics. He says, in this case, first you have to know this. And al-Ghazali, of course, was familiar with all these things. Al-Ghazali gets bored. And then there comes the call to prayer, the adhan. And al-Ghazali stops Omar al-Khayyam and says, stop here, because truth has just called and time for falsehood is over. It's an interesting passage, and I recommend that you read it. Now, that's all we have. That's all we have about their relationship. So meaning in this case, was there any influence of Omar al-Khayyam on al-Ghazali? Not that we know of, other than there is this dispute that the two have, where one is a falasuf and the other is a mutakallim, and the two of them debate each other very, very briefly. And was there any influence of al-Ghazali on Omar al-Khayyam's Rubaiyat? This is an equally speculative question, particularly because we're not entirely sure whether the Rubaiyat, this is from a historical point of view, we're not entirely sure whether at least all the Rubaiyat that we have can be associated with Omar al-Khayyam. The earliest association of the Rubaiyat to Omar al-Khayyam only starts 100 years later with Fakhruddin Arazi. I don't doubt that some of them go back to him, but whether all of them go back to Omar al-Khayyam is a question. So far about that.
Thank you so much, Frank Griffel, for the answer given. Another question here by Muhammad Babikir. Please correct me if I pronounce it wrong. The question here, the Sufi sheikhs that al-Ghazali refers to in Al-Ihya, do their characteristics map on to the modern tariqah institutions and their sheikh, or have these modern forms straight away from the true path of their predecessors?
Right. Good question as well. So basically, Tariqa Sufism is something that didn't exist in al-Ghazali's times, or it just began to exist. So the first tariqas are forming, at this point. And in fact, we think that al-Ghazali plays a very important role there, because he himself, when he actually leaves Baghdad, Niẓāmiyya, he first goes on a pilgrimage, goes back to Baghdad, and then very quickly goes to Tus, and he founds his madrasa and his khanqa. And for his khanqa, he actually establishes a number of ground rules. People who lived in the khanqa had to have a job. They couldn't just linger around. But then they also needed to engage in certain types of dhikr. And what we assume is that the rules that al-Ghazali actually developed for his khanqa were actually rules that were more or less, or had a strong influence on later tariqa rules. But generally speaking, it's not in this case that al-Ghazali, is seen as a founding figure of a tariqa. However, when we, for instance, take a look at the Naqshbandiyya order, the Naqshbandiyya order has in their silsila has not Muhammad al-Ghazali, but al-Ghazali's brother Ahmed al-Ghazali, and that's an interesting thing in this case. So the Naqshbandiyya order, which of course comes into is founded later, but we have in the 12th century, basically 50 to 60 years after the death of al-Ghazali, we have the beginning of Tariqa Sufism. The Qadariyya order, for instance, goes back to a figure, Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, who lived at the middle of the 12th century, basically 50 years after al-Ghazali. And so here, this is the beginning of Tariqa Sufism, meaning the answer to your question is the sheikhs that appear in the Ihya Ulumuddin, these are not people in this case who practice Sufism within a tariqa. No, that only comes later in the 12th century. Also, Qadariyya, Kubrawiyya. These are the oldest tariqas that we actually have, and they are 12th and 13th century. But we assume that the way al-Ghazali actually organizes Sufism, also through his Ihya Ulumuddin, has an important role on the development of Tariqa Sufism.
Thank you so much, Frank Griffel, for your answer given. We have another question here from Jamizal. Prof, could you explain further on active intelligence and whether this concept is in conformity with the Holy Quran?
Oh, that's a question that I can actually not. I can answer the first half of the question. Whether it's compatible with the Quran is something in this case that I think you yourself have to decide. So the active intellect is an idea that appears first in commentary literature on Aristotle. Aristotle himself wrote a book which is known as On the Soul, often referred to by its Latin title, De Anima, and it was divided into 3 parts. And in the last and the third part, there is a chapter, a very brief chapter, which is only 1 page, less than 1 page. It's the 5th chapter in book number 3, where Aristotle actually says the soul, like everything, the soul is divided in an active part and a passive part. And he basically talks a little bit what the active part do and says a little bit what the passive part do. It's a very cryptic chapter, but it seems to be very important for Aristotle to explain the process of thinking, particularly the process of, you might say, conceptual thinking, meaning in this case, we use concepts that apply to lots of things, universals. And later on, many centuries later, 3 centuries later, Greek scholars then write commentaries about this. And the most important one is a commentary from the 2nd century AD or CE, from Common Era, is by a Greek scholar called Alexander of Aphrodisias. And he actually coins these phrases. He says in this case, there is an active element and there's a passive element. So there is the active intellect, and then there is the passive intellect, which is also by virtue of Alexander of Aphrodisias known as the so-called material intellect. Material not because it's connected to matter more than the active intellect, that's not the case, but because like matter it can become anything. So it's like, the idea here is the Greek idea in this case of hyle, like, formless matter. It can become a house, can become, water, can become anything. And Alexander of Aphrodisias teaches that our conceptual ideas, like for instance, when you talk about a horse and you think about horseness, that those actually we receive from the active intellect, because there are elements there in these universals that we cannot perceive from sense perception alone. And that's a general concept here, which is of course then further elaborated by Muslim thinkers. Al-Farabi, Ibn Sīnā are very important. And generally the idea in this case is whenever we use concepts to talk about, to understand each other, that the fact that we are able to use the same concepts, meaning hoarseness, for instance, is because we all have these concepts one way or another from the active intellect. How we exactly have them, that's again a philosophical question, very much disputed, but that's the general idea. Now, is this compatible in this case with the Quran? Historically, I can say, I'm a historian, I can only say in this case that for such thinkers as Ibn Sīnā, Al-Farabi, even al-Kindi, they saw no conflict between this type of idea about concept acquisition and Quranic thinking. And the same is true in this case for lots of other, even mutakallimun later on apply this. If you, for instance, think about somebody like Ad-Din al-Iji, al-Baydawi, also in this case, they didn't see any conflict between this type of concept acquisition and the Quran.
Thank you, Prof. Frank Griffel, for your answer. Another question here by Luqman Hakim. Assalamu alaikum, Prof. Can you explain more what Imam al-Ghazali really means by gaining knowledge from celestial spheres? If I remember correctly, since he follows the Ash'ari creed, doesn't he believe that the unseen knowledge really comes from God instead of celestial spheres?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and that's a question I deal in the major part of my book. You're right. So the classical Ash'ari idea in this case is that God creates everything directly. So there's a cosmology behind it that we call occasionalism. It also means in this case that every idea, for instance, humans have are created directly by God. And it's true that there are certain books that al-Ghazali subscribes to this kind of set of ideas and to this cosmology. However, when you actually read al-Ghazali closely, and the al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl is a good example for that, you actually realize that he also had a second set of ideas about God's cosmology. So then this is an application of Ibn Sina's and the falāsifa's concept of cosmology, where you actually have God at the top of causal chains, and the causal chains, then God uses these causal chains to create the kind of effects, in this case, that he wants to have happen in this world. So in this set of teachings, your ideas or our ideas are equally determined by God, but they are determined by what we call secondary causes. For instance, my ideas in this case are, all my, content of my soul, of my mind in this case are, go back to certain things that I've learned, certain motivations that I have, and these are the causes that equally create cognitions, we might say. And the same is then true, and the knowledge that I have, the things that I've learned, the motivations that I have, they actually also go back, and here comes, in this case, the idea of the active intellect in there. And the active intellect is one of the celestial spheres that is connected to, in this case, the sphere of the Earth, the sublunar sphere. That is the set of ideas there. And Al-Ghazali, the conclusion that I have in my book is that when Al-Ghazali uses both concepts in different of his books, and it's interesting that even in the Ihya Ulumuddin, there are some books that use occasionalist cosmology, and other books that clearly, very, very clearly work with the cosmological model of the falāsifa, if he does that, then it indicates to us, and this is my conclusion, of course, that he was undecided about what really happened, or what really, the way in this case, how al-Ghazali, how God in this case relates to his creation. And that is, and I have quotes for this, I argue for this, I think I have evidence for this, insofar as al-Ghazali himself says, not very, here I paraphrase a little bit, in this case he says, given the fact that, revelation, meaning the Quran, doesn't tell us precisely how God creates, given also that philosophical teachings are not apodictic about this, are not demonstrative about this, and neither are Ash'arite Kalam concepts demonstrative about this, meaning in this case the arguments there are, on both sides are good, but none of them are conclusive. We as humans have not given knowledge about it. This is something that God basically kept for himself. And whether, occasionalism is true or secondary causality is something that we as humans cannot decide. And so al-Ghazali basically works with both models. So on the one hand, you could say, yes, God creates all our, the content of our thoughts directly, or through the mediation of secondary causes. And here the celestial intellects would be seen as secondary causes. And I pointed out, I read the passage where, I believe al-Ghazali actually says, after 10 years of pondering over this, I've come to conclude in this case that Ibn Sīnā is actually right.
Thank you, Prof, for your answer given. Another question here by Jamizal. He asks, does al-Ghazali believes in martabat al-wujud, or the degrees of existence, as espoused by Ibn Arabi, such as the concept of a'yan thabita, ahadiyah, a'yan kharijiyah, and others?
Right. Now, of course, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi lived, more than 100, or about 100 years after al-Ghazali. He died, 140 years after, 130 years after him. So when I read Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, then, I see clear development always, from thoughts that, I'm very familiar with from Al-Ghazali, and that Ibn Arabi actually develops. Meaning in this case, the short answer is no. There is no, these, stages or stages of existence do not exist. However, Al-Ghazali has its own categorization of existence, which in a very interesting book that I recommend you might take a look at. It's called Faisal al-Tafriqa Bayna al-Islam wa al-Zandaqa. And there he actually, his goal is basically to decide, what is a legitimate interpretation of revelation and what is an illegitimate interpretation of, and then there's what is a correct one and what is a false one. And in this context, he actually develops the idea that, what you have to do when you read the Quran is you have to acknowledge a certain level of wujud that is associated to a certain passage in the Quran. So he has wujud dhati. Then the next one is wujud hissi, wujud khayali, wujud ruhi, and wujud shubhi. And so he has 5 levels of wujud. And again, this is a distinction that actually has a very philosophical background in Ibn Sīnā. These are, connected to inner senses. Khayal is an inner sense, hiss is an inner sense. And aql is also an inner sense, which is behind, it's actually wujud aqli. That's right. The 4th one is wujud aqli, not ruhi, wujud aqli. So these things in this case, so you find something like this in Al-Ghazali, and I recommend that you read or take a look at Faisal al-Tafriqa Bayna al-Zandaqa, very, very interesting book, also under heavy influence, I would say, from Ibn Sīnā. And by the way, I also think that Ibn Arabi is actually picking up a lot of points in this case that Ibn Sīnā makes earlier. Anyhow, different lecture.
Thanks, Prof. Griffel, for your answer. Here we have another question by Nuruddin. Prof, does the development of philosophy after al-Ghazali tend to be so different between the Sunni and Shiite worlds? Or can we actually look for parallels? For example, regarding efforts to synthesize Sufism and philosophy in both the Sunni and Shiite worlds.
That's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure I'm in a position to answer that well. Generally speaking, I would say for the centuries right after al-Ghazali, there's no real difference between Sunnism and Shiism here. It's also so in the century after al-Ghazali, we have two major philosophers who develop philosophical schools by themselves, we might say. One is Fakhruddin Arazi, and the other is, of course, Yahya Sohrawardi. Now, and both of them start out as, we have no reason to believe that any one of them is a Shiite. They may have, but generally speaking, even Sohrawardi is somebody in this case whom we associate in this case with Sunni teachings and with the Sunni identity during his lifetime, and that continues to the 13th and 14th century. But of course, it's then in Safavid Iran, when we go into the the 16th and the 17th century, that Sohrawardi becomes somebody in this case who has its own reception within Shiite Islam, and so that there is a difference there. Meaning in this case, the moment in this case Iran becomes a largely Shiite country, which, as you know, happens only after around 1500, after the Safavids actually conquer Iran. So I would say in this case, for many centuries, no, there is no, there's both schools engage with the same kind of material. Both schools also engage very much, you might say, even with al-Ghazali, with Ibn Sīnā, with these thinkers in an equal measure. It's just in this case that I would say, from the period of 1500, when you have on the Sunni side a focus on the Ottoman Empire, and on the Shiite side you have a focus on the Safavid Empire, then you see certain differences developing.
Thank you so much, Prof. Here another question, also by Nuruddin. Prof, was Ghazali only known in medieval Europe as a student or respondent to Ibn Sina, or was he seen as an independent thinker from Ibn Sina?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the short answer is yes. So al-Ghazali was not seen as what he really was, namely a critic of Ibn Sina in his Tahafut al-falāsifa, but what was mostly known by al-Ghazali was the Maqasid al-falāsifa, and that was translated in an incomplete way. So scholars in Europe in the Latin Middle Ages thought that he was indeed a faithful follower of Ibn Sina. However, it's already in the 15th century. So then, the Tahafut al-Tahafut is by Averroes, by Ibn Rushd, is translated around 1330, and some people do understand that the al-Ghazali, who Ibn Rushd actually responds to in that book, cannot be a follower of Ibn Sina. So that's then a certain understanding which actually becomes very prominent then, you might say, in the European Renaissance. So around 1550 you have authors who clearly understand at that point in time what was going on in the history of philosophy in the Islamic world, and they acknowledge that al-Ghazali, particularly the al-Ghazali who speaks through Ibn Rushd's Tahafut al-Tahafut in the quotations there, is a very original thinker, in his Tahafut al-Falāsifa, of course, and whose ideas then have influence on European Renaissance thinking.
Thank you, Prof. This question is by Luqman Hakim, which is actually a follow-up question. I think the idea of secondary causes and occasionalism can coincide. Could we say that he actually, he refers to al-Ghazali, believe in both similar to the idea of Malebranche idea of agent cause?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, you could always say that, you know, if you believe in an occasionalist universe, you can say that God has certain habits, and these habits are the laws of nature, right? But underlying also Malebranche cosmology is an atomistic occasionalist view. So if you sure, I mean, if you want to make that point, and I think the argument that, I know this argument, of course, very well, is that whenever al-Ghazali uses the word cause, it's like illa or sabab, he only uses it in a metaphorical way. There is no such a thing in this case like a real sabab. You can make that argument, sure, but al-Ghazali does not give any textual hint for that. You know, he never says in this case, when I use the word illa, I only use it, you know, as a way to explain God's ada. He doesn't do that. So, in fact, you know, he really has, you know, he has some statements where he clearly says, you know, if you do actually believe that certain things are possible according to an occasionalist universe, then this is a mistake. What I do is, this is a question I engage very closely in my book. I suggest you read the book. If you disagree, you know, you might actually argue against it.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Griffel. There is another two questions by Nuruddin. I will read the first. Prof, is active intellect the same as the term separate intellect used by Averroes?
And the short answer is not exactly. So what Averroes actually has in mind with the separate intellect is the material intellect. In his long commentary on the De Anima of Aristotle. Averroes has his own noetics, as we say in this case, his own way of explaining conceptual knowledge, which is different from the one I explained before by Alexander of Aphrodisias. For Averroes, we do actually form our concepts with the help of the active intellect, which is not exactly, you know, a storehouse of concepts as it is in earlier concepts, but, you know, more or less, you know, the ability to form our concepts ourselves, that is what the active intellect is for Averroes. But we form them then, you know, in a material intellect, in a passive intellect. And this passive intellect for Averroes, and this is here is different from many other thinkers of the tradition, is separate from us, is a single one for all of humanity and is separate from us. It has similarities to Alexander of Aphrodisias and Avicenna's ideas, but on the other hand, it's also very distinct. So simply speaking, in this case, you know, every human, you know, builds their own set of universals, but we all share them through the fact that they cannot exist other than in a separate intellect that we all share. But we all collectively, so to speak, work on that. Whereas the idea with the active intellect is that you know, it comes from above. It comes from eventually from God.
Another question here by Nuruddin. What does it mean that al-Ghazali rejected the Aristotelian four causes?
Well, he did. So what does it mean? So as I pointed out, the way I see it is al-Ghazali actually has two sets of teachings on causes. On the one hand, he accepts Avicenna's teachings on causes, on secondary causality, and there, of course, he accepts the four causes. But if you actually are an occasionalist, then, you know, if you're an Ash'arite occasionalist, then of course there are no causes other than just one single cause. That is God, and God is the cause then of everything. And you know, and if you talk about the four Aristotelian causes, you know the final cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the material cause, those of course have no meaning in an occasionalist cosmology.
Thank you, Prof. Frank Griffel. We have here by Muhammad Babikir. He wanted to ask you directly. Please, Muhammad Babikir,
Allah.
tafadhal.
Yes, assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. And you pronounced my name perfectly, so thank you. I just wanted to add a follow-up for the question on about tariqas and sort of their relationship with al-Ghazali. I would say the question sort of came from this perhaps Salafi-inspired sort of critique of modern tasawwuf, which is that sort of it pretends to be or claims to be, let's say, based on the original authentic tasawwuf of al-Ghazali and the sort of the sheikhs that he based his work on, but they have sort of strayed quite away from it with lots of bid'ah and lots of like no longer a focus on the akhlaq and the tazkiyah, let's say, that al-Ghazali was focused on. So I was just interested with your sort of knowledge of the modern day tariqas and their implementations, like how valid is that critique? Yes.
Prof, I think you mute your mic.
Yes. Yeah, I could catch it.
It wasn't me, I think. Anybody? Okay, here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I should say again, you know, I'm a historian of thought, and I don't use words like bid'ah, which seem to imply a value judgment. What I look at is developments, Al-Ghazali's Sufism is a certain development on an earlier kind of Sufism. And you would say Tariqa Sufism is a development on al-Ghazali Sufism. Questions of authenticity are, in my opinion, you know, a little bit of misguided there. I mean, but that's me because I don't take part in, you know, disputes about, you know, whether Sufism is bid'ah or not. At the end of the day, you know, is Sufism at the what Sufis claim is, of course, the authenticity of their understanding of knowledge in this case, which even go back to Muhammad, right? I mean, that seems to be, and those claims, Al-Ghazali, I don't think makes any much difference to. He has, of course, you know, he quotes Junaid, he quotes Abu Yazid. He has a connection to earlier figures of Sufism, and he himself is the connecting point of later figures, in this case, to these early Sufis, and through that, in this case, through a community of Sufis that may or may not have existed in the days of Muhammad. So I see developments everywhere. I also see a lot of developments on the Salafi side. And whether one would call this bid'ah or not, that's something that don't take part of.
All right. We have here Muhammad Mubarak Habib Muhammad wanted to ask, please, brother.
Thank you very much. Hi, Prof. I go straight to the question. As an professor of history of ideas, as you have mentioned, and particularly in the half an hour that you have talked about, the focus was how the idea of soul within the text of al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl in al-Ghazali's understanding shifted from a kalam perspective of the soul, right, into the philosophical perspective of the soul. Right. So that was the message that you wanted us to get. That's why the whole topic of today is the philosophical foundation of al-Ghazali Sufism. So that shift that he has from kalam to philosophy, and philosophy here is more of an Abyssinian and Ibn Sina's way of the falāsifa, I would say that you're talking about. Now, he wrote his Munqidh at the end of, near to the end of his life. after completed writing is Ihya Ulumuddin. And it might be that we could see that the attempts inside Ihya Ulumuddin, as how we have mentioned just now, also the idea of occasionalism and also the idea of cause and all that, which comes again from the Kalam school and also comes from the philosophical school. So within Ihya Ulumuddin, you see both of this that is been written at different parts, and he himself says that at some parts of it, that if you were to follow Ash'arites' way of understanding, you will get stuck and you will not be able to explain a number of phenomenons in that. And in Kitab Tauhid wa Tawakkul, it was a clear Avicenna's way on how he projected all the idea of Tawheed, right, into its various levels. Could we say that the development of Sufism after the Imam al-Ghazali's Munqidh and then Ihya Ulumuddin was more towards I would say, a wasat position between the occasionalism, the Kalam way of looking at things, which is very atomistic, and the philosophical way, which is very causal in its way, that looks at things from cause and effect. Yeah.
Right. First of all, thank you very much for paraphrasing very well what I think I wanted to convey. And as for your question, I know this might sound a little bit frustrating, and maybe also, but it's something in this case that there hasn't been done enough work on. I myself tried to do this in my later book, in my newest book, which is the formation of post-classical philosophy, which is, by the way, let me just hold this up here. And my impression there is that what actually develops in Islam are two different ways to talk about this. One is books of Kalam. We're very familiar with that, like for instance, the Mawaqif of al-Iji as an example, or, classical textbooks of Kalam that we're very familiar with. And then and they use an occasionalist frame entirely. And they might be engaged in this thing, in this case, when we talk about, the natural laws, we mean al-ḍalāl and all this. And then at the same time, there are also books of hikmah, which, exist, like for instance, Mabahith al-Mashikiyya of Fakhruddin Arazi, Mulakhas fil Mantiq wal Hikmah, also by him, and several others. And they actually use secondary causality. And my impression now is that this distinction, so where al-Ghazali actually says, I don't know, I don't know what really happens with God's creation, that this actually then is seen in a broader way even, and leads to different ways to engage with even ideas about God. So whereas al-Ghazali has one unified idea about God, he only is, I think, uncertain how God acts. But he says in this case, of course, God is a free agent. He's a fa'il mukhtar, and the world was created at one point in time. So there's hudūth al-alam. Al-Ghazali was clear about this. I think in this case, in the later tradition, 100 years later, when we look at somebody like Fakhruddin Arazi, he's less clear about that either. So there are certain developments happening there. Now, when it comes then to Sufism, so this is hikmah and kalam, and then particular with Ibn Arabi and the commentaries on his books, particularly the Fusus al-Hikam, you actually get a third group establishing of Sufi authors who actually develop their own position about all these questions, like Hudūth al-Alam, Qidam al-Alam, Fa'al Mukhtar, Mujib, all this, in this case, their own position. And it's very hard. I don't think in this case that there has been enough work done in this case to really elaborate what's happening there. There's a great book that I always recommend to my students in this case, that is Jami's Durra al-Fakhira, which really puts together these, presents these three different schools, the Mutakallimun, the Hukama, and the Sufiya. So it's very interesting what happened there. And my impression is that, maybe the Sufis, if you can actually say that, so if the Mutakallimun in this case are occasionalists, and if the Hukama are on the side of secondary causality, yes, then the Sufis seem to be somewhere in between.
Thank you, Prof, for your books.
Thank you.
I've been reading a number of your books, right?
Thank you.
Including the latest one that you have also. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes. Okay. Should we through?
Actually, we have two questions here by Nuruddin. Prof, is it true that Descartes and Hume were influenced by al-Ghazali?
We don't know, basically. So there is an interesting parallel between Hume, not so much, maybe indirectly, of course, because al-Ghazali's ideas became known in the 16th century overall. But with Descartes, we have a very interesting parallel between, the second chapter in al-Munqidh min al-ḍalāl and his first meditations. And I think in this case, eventually the judgment on that is still out there. Maybe Descartes had known this text, but there is currently no evidence for that. But it's very hard to say it didn't happen. So it's possible.
Actually, I have two questions for you, Prof. Griffel. Firstly, about the Mishkat al-Anwar. Is it true that Mishkat al-Anwar is a book written by al-Ghazali, or it is not written by him?
Well, of course it was written by him. We know when he wrote it, under which circumstances. It was written by him.
Okay, secondly, actually a few months ago, there has been again a narrative saying that al-Ghazali is the cause for the we can say backwardness in Muslim countries and Muslim civilization, even
Yes.
scientific thinking.
Sure.
What are your comments on this narrative, Prof?
I think that is wrong, and I've argued against it in my first book and then also my second book. This is something that came up in the 19th century and was actually first brought up by European thinkers who talked about the decline of Islam. But this is a colonial discourse, right? I mean, I don't think there is a decline in Islam. You needed to talk about decline in Islam in order to create a colonial empire. So there is a lot, as I say, you might actually read particularly the introduction of my second book where, the formation book, where I clearly argue against that. No, al-Ghazali is not responsible for any assumed decline. There wasn't even a decline in Islam. And al-Ghazali, developed Islamic thought significantly. So can we take one more question? Because I actually then also have to go.
Yeah, maybe this is the last question is by Muhammad Mubarak. He raised his hand here.
Yeah. Sorry, Prof. Just now you mentioned about a book that you recommend. Can you just repeat the title?
Oh, this was Jami ad-Durra al-Fakhira, and it has a longer title. And it's an Arabic book. He wrote it on the request of the Ottoman Sultan Muhammad Fateh. So ad-Durra al-Fakhira by Jami. And Jami was a follower of Ibn Arabi.
Al-Jami, yeah? Prof?
Jami, yes. Jim, Alif, Mim, yeah.
Okay. Shukran, Prof. Thank you.
Afwan.
All right. I think that would be the last question that can be asked to Prof. Frank Griffel, because he has another occasion that he must attend to. So I would like, as a representative of Tradisi, would like to thank Prof. Frank Griffel for accepting our invitation to tonight's lecture. I believe that everyone benefited a lot, and the lecture is so much enlightening, and your answers given are also enlightening to all the audiences. For the audiences, thank you so much for coming for tonight's special lecture. It is very much interesting to see that Malaysians are interested. Maybe there are some non-Malaysians here. It's a very interesting development among Malaysians to be in this intellectual discourse. As a representative of Tradisi, I would like to thank you all very much. And I also like to apologize if there are any shortcomings for this lecture. For your information, this lecture will be published online at YouTube. We will be putting the link for the YouTube at our Facebook. Please look into our Facebook after these few days to see if there are any updates on the recording. Thank you all very much. Inshallah,
Thank
there
you
will
as
be
well.
another next lecture next month by another speaker. All right. Thank you, Prof. Griffel, and thank you, everyone.
Thank